Ed, you're live.
He's never been a little bit. Where is with the camera?
Yeah, the camera is. Oh, looks like a laser. Just to be shy. That's it. So you can be a boy. Just be a boy.
You don't want to know.
No, like when we're talking, we should be like, hey, Chuds, this is our presentation.
That's so bad.
Oh. What's up, boys? So this is our presentation.
Hey guys.
Hey guys, I got Chud to my right, and I'm Foy Foy. So.
You're not live.
No, it's fine.
There's fanboy
This is not like,
Yeah, I'm just waiting to hear
it's not like
information.
senior
You're on top
thesis,
of it.
like,
Yeah.
Are you guys playing Hunger
People.
I was just gonna write like the two
People.
stuff. I'm not, because I like just formatted my PowerPoint to that, but like it doesn't matter. Are you, mine is just a bunch of calculations. I have that on my phone. Okay, I'm literally just speaking numbers from my crew. I guess you could just look at it and just be like, yeah, that's what we got. Be like, it is math.
We just sit and watch. Like, it's not.
If they ask why we picked .03, it's basically because one,
At that point, you practice so much.
if you went any higher, I don't think
Yeah,
the instruments would pay it. Two, if you went too much lower, it wouldn't give you much money.
I'm literally, that's the question.
Okay,
There was no revenue
we are live, so please come it off. So, okay, I think we're about ready to start. Nice. Yeah, good. So, hello everyone, good afternoon. And welcome to the Green Program Capstone Project presentations. Over the past 6 days here in Iceland, these students have been learning about renewable energy and innovation and sustainable development in Iceland. Working with the Iceland School of Energy and with various power plants and organizations in Iceland. And now they will be presenting their capstone projects, which is entrepreneurial solutions to sustainable development issues. They've been working on these projects for the past 6 days, and no idea is too big for the capstone projects, but they'll be talking about the feasibility of their ideas as well in the presentation. We'll have 15 minutes for each presentation, with 5 to 10 minutes of questions afterwards. So, like I said earlier, we will, I'll let you know when you have 5, 3, and 1 minute left. And then, yeah, after that, we will have questions for each, about 10 minutes. And I believe it is the Circle Solar course, yes. Hold the mic? Yeah. Pass the mic. I'll totally run this over. Okay, we could begin.
Hello everyone, my name is Sydney, and this is our capstone idea that's called Full Circle Solar. And so first I'm going to start with a little outline of our presentation. We're going to go through the team introduction, and then the context in the golden circle, then the business model canvas, the sustainability complex, and the sustainability development goals that our project aligns with, and then finally some comments at the end. So as I said, my name is Sydney Kalin. I go to North Carolina State University, and I major in electrical engineering.
My name is Noah Kaplan. I'm studying at Cornell University, and I am majoring in environmental business.
My name is Daniele Caglioni. I'm an undergrad at the University of Colorado Boulder studying geoscience and geography.
And finally, my name is Kevin Pang, and I'm studying environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University.
Okay, to start us off, I'm going to give a little bit of background information about solar. So, solar panels typically last around 25 to 30 years, but they lose efficiency by that time, up to 78 million tons of those panels could be in landfills. And so the reason why this is really bad is because, to start with, solar panels have a lot of toxic materials such as lead, chromium, cadmium, and some other things. So that causes a lot of environmental damage when they're just tossed into landfills. And then also, when a country doesn't have enough recycling or landfill regulations, a lot of times the big solar farms can just ship them overseas, which is also illegal dumping, which is bad. And then solar panels also are full of really expensive, important materials such as precious metals like silicon and aluminum. And so when we're just tossing them into landfills, that can create a resource scarcity. And a lot of times, many solar panels are put in landfills, about 90%, which means that less than 10% are actually recycled. And the reason for this is because solar panels are technically difficult to break down into their different components and recycle each one. It's also a very expensive process, and there's a lack of recycling infrastructure, especially in the States. And as well in the States, the recycling policies differ state to state. And so all of those reasons make it hard for solar panels to be recycled. And so the reason why we chose to do our project about solar and do full circle solar is because we want to reduce the solar panel waste and make solar energy more accessible to low-income communities. And so how we're going to do that is we're going to partner with solar farms, especially large utility scale ones in California specifically, to acquire and refurbish retired panels. And we're going to install those on low-income homes with volunteer organizations such as Habitat for Humanity. And then we will recycle these panels when the homeowners contact us and need replacements. And so essentially what we're creating is a nonprofit organization that repurposes retired solar panels, installs them in low-income homes, and then manages the full life cycle of those solar panels through removal, replacement, and recycling, hence the name Full Circle Solar.
All right. So next up, we have the business model canvas. So the first part of this is our key resources. So obviously, locally we have city permits. So we're going to be partnering with cities and municipalities to acquire these permits. And we also have the retired panels that are going to be coming from local PV farms. We want to make sure that they're local to also cut down on transmission due to transport. So we're acquiring our solar panels from farms in the state of California. And secondly, we have our human resources. So obviously we have our solar photovoltaic installer/technicians who are going to be doing the installation as well as the maintenance. And nextly, we have fundraising and financial teams, and we have the marketing team.
Our key activities initially start with purchasing these retired solar panels. Like Sydney mentioned, we're looking to get these solar panels from big PV companies that have many solar panels. They typically try to purchase new or next-gen solar panels, and so they have these second-hand, second-generation solar panels that typically go to waste. So those are the key panels that we're trying to acquire. Next, we want to test and refurbish these panels and then partner up for installation. We're looking to partner with companies or organizations like Habitat for Humanity and the Solar Foundation to really distribute these panels and then assemble them in housing. Lastly, we want to remove and reinstall these panels and bring them to their end of life cycle by retiring them properly.
And so as Daniele mentioned, some of our key partners and shareholders, to start with, we're going to have donors that we will receive a lot of our funding from, and then partner with Habitat for Humanity, which they just build homes for low-income communities. The Solar Foundation, which is an organization that provides funding for similar projects, and the Solar Cycle, which is a recycling company that works throughout the states but also in California. And their big draw is that they recycle about 95% of the solar panel components, whereas a lot of times it's only about 10% of the panels that actually get recycled. And then we're also going to work with district partnerships.
Our channels for outreach are really NPO organizations and partnerships. Like Sydney mentioned, it's really mostly going to be Habitat for Humanity and the Solar Foundation. We also want to partner up with districts. They can be local, government, health, school, in residential as well. Being able to partner with these districts, specifically starting in California, will really give us access to starting a small infrastructure where we can then expand slowly and progress even more. Our types of intervention really rely on hands-on installation. We want to hire some employees, some installers and technicians that can really install these panels and also perform any sort of maintenance. We want direct customer service and direct contact service as well. So that way, in case any individuals in these low-income housing communities can really reach out in case a panel is broken or needs some sort of fixing. And also these technicians can be used for retiring the panels properly as well.
So there's two main segments that we had to consider when thinking about our idea. So it's first the beneficiary, or who is benefiting from our intervention, and as well as the customer, or who will be paying for the solar panels and the other costs associated with what we're trying to do. So for the beneficiary, obviously the low-income families in which on the houses, who live in the houses on which we will install these solar panels will benefit because they won't have to pay, they'll have reduced energy costs each month instead of needing to pay for the full electricity bill, which energy costs are a lot more expensive in California. They can instead put this money towards groceries or perhaps saving for long-term goals. These solar farms will also benefit from our organization because we're taking the waste that they have to recycle anyways, because in California, solar farms are required to recycle their solar panels, and we're instead taking their waste and we're taking their waste and instead we're giving them a second life, and then we will properly recycle them through solar cycle. And for the customer, the two main people who are paying for these costs are the donors, who we will outreach to and apply, and also the government, who we will apply we will apply for government aid in order to be able to access some of the money that the government has set aside for interventions like these.
So next we want to look at what value does our business actually, offer. So first, obviously, we have clean energy. By installing solar panels on homes, we're going to reduce how much they are reliant on, big coal and natural gas plants. And then we're also reducing solar panel waste at landfill. Like Cindy said, there's a lot that isn't recycled properly or that will end up there. And obviously, how are we going to measure success of our company? Because at the end of the day, we're a business, and that's going to be how many homes are we able to equip panels. If Habitat for Humanity builds 20 new homes, we'll be able to be like, hey, we got 18 of those homes equipped panels. That's a great way for us to measure how successful we are. And then obviously, lastly, homes and communities that work with us will have to pay less for the electricity. Like Kevin mentioned earlier, they can put this money towards other things. Obviously, in California, electricity can be a big expense. And so, for low-income home families where they're, can be living paycheck to paycheck, having that alleviation of not having to pay electricity or not having to pay as much electricity to be able to buy more, healthy groceries or buying school supplies or, save for those long-term goals is really important. And so, yeah, that's how we're going to generate value.
So there's three main costs that we associate with our idea. So first, it's the purchasing of the secondhand solar panels. So looking at the median, or what the median project for an average house looks like, and how much solar power that they actually install, it's around 7,000 kilowatts. And taking this and multiplying it by the average number for how much a kilowatt costs to install of secondhand solar, you get around $4,000. So it'll be around $4,000 to buy those solar panels that we install in those homes, and that's per home. And for planning, permitting, and surveys, in California, it costs there's a cap of $450 for doing small-scale solar installation on residential homes. And we expect to share that cost with Habitat for Humanity. So that, along with planning and surveying, we expect the cost to come out at around $500. And finally, we obviously need to train and pay our workers. So in California, there's a mean salary of $65,000, and this number will be, and this is just a ballpark, and the number will be a little bit larger because of the initial training that will happen. But these are just rough numbers.
So obviously, mentioned at the end of the day, we are a company, so we hope to be successful. And obviously, what we do with our surplus as being a nonprofit, we're not giving that money back to shareholders, but we will use it to scale up and move into other states. One of the states we had discussed was Texas. They have a lot of solar potential and large PV farms, so obviously a lot of that will end up, not being recycled properly. So that's where we would help step in. Next up is, obviously how are we going to generate revenue to operate? So a big chunk, 40% will come from government grants and environmental funding. So, California Public Utility Commission has set aside $9.7 million for solar on multifamily and affordable housing. So that's a great, grant that we could apply for and get a good chunk of money. And then another 40% will come from corporate partnership and funding, like we mentioned earlier, the Solar Foundation. And then lastly, our 20% will come from recycling companies buying the panels off us, such as Solar Recycle. And then that way we also know that the panels are being taken care of properly and, in a responsible way.
In terms of the sustainability complex and the SDGs, this really begins with the state level. So initially, we want to operate on a statewide level, looking to expand over time. Like Noah mentioned, Texas is a fantastic state that has a lot of potential. They have really large PV farms and a lot of secondhand panels that can really be refurbished and reused. We want to start with California because we want to partner up with their districts and look to build off their progressive, focused solar initiatives. Also, on a state level, it's really going to reduce the carbon footprint of the state itself. This can be really good when taking into consideration the amount of clean energy and renewables each state is consuming. Next, this translates to a household level where low-income and low-community households will have access to solar. This will provide greater electricity security and also greater access to clean and renewable energy. Lastly, it impacts people on an individual level because this will provide lower power bills, and as Noah mentioned as well, these lower bills can provide extra money for these families to use towards school supplies, education, groceries, anything else they really need this money for. Also, on an individual level, they're going to be reducing their personal carbon footprint.
To go over our SDGs, we pointed out 4 main ones that we would, impact. So obviously number 7, we have affordable clean energy. So we, like we discussed before, families will be less reliant on energy that's being produced by burning coal or natural gas. We'll hit number 10, which is reducing inequality with and among countries. So we're really hitting that within the countries. So families will be able to, have these affordable energy and put more money towards somewhere else and, really build up and how, no longer be considered low income. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. So we're helping Habitat for Humanity building safer homes and, making them more affordable through not having to worry about your electricity bill. And then number 12, insurable sustainable consumption. Like we mentioned before, a lot of it is recycled or recycled irresponsibly. So through this business and this operations, we'll make sure that the product is used through its entirety of its life, and you get the most out of it that you can.
So just moving on to some final comments. So first, we wanted to explore, in order to explore the feasibility of our project, we wanted to see if any similar projects have been done before. And the answer is actually yes. So in Belgium, they have these social houses, which are essentially the Belgian equivalent of low-income housing. And we found that there were 40 Flemish social, that in 2022, there were 40 Flemish social housing companies who decided to invest £155 million in order to install around 400,000 solar panels on around 53,000 homes. So just the fact that there has been a project similar to ours, which has installed solar on low-income housing, shows the feasibility and of our project. And so just to conclude some of the things that we've talked about during this presentation, so Full Circle Solar is a nonprofit organization that works to provide clean, affordable energy to low-income households in California. We buy retired solar panels off of these large solar farms, and we refurbish them. And then we partner with Habitat for Humanity in order to install these refurbished solar panels onto these new low-income houses. And then finally, once the life cycle has fully ended and these panels are no longer useful, we recycle them through Solar Cycle, ensuring that they are responsibly recycled. And this is our business model canvas with everything that we have talked about filled out in all in one place. We've already talked about all this, so I just wanted to put it up there for your reference. And finally, these are the references that we went through in order to find the information for our presentation. Any questions? Yeah.
So are you mainly focused on like affordable housing that's built by the government, or just like houses that are inhabited by people who are making like a certain amount of money relative to like a number? I'm curious.
I think our main goal was to focus on new homes that were being built. So obviously not like homes that people who are underneath a certain threshold are currently living in, but obviously homes that like government is building, but also Habitat for Humanity, which is a big, company that their whole point is, they're volunteer based. That way they can sell the homes for cheaper and to people that, don't have the access to pay, $500,000 for a home. So that's kind of what we're targeting is those like, people who are being gifted homes from the government or, they're just very cheap and that way, the goal is new homes, not people that are already living in homes with that are underneath a certain threshold.
So you had mentioned um, a partner solar cycle.
Yeah.
So is solar cycle, do they just like recycle the panels, or they do similar to what you're trying to do with like reusing them?
As far as I'm aware, they just recycle them. Yeah, and like I was saying earlier, like their big thing is that they recycle 95% of the solar panels themselves. And a lot of times when companies try to recycle them themselves, they only do about 10%, just because it gets more and more expensive and harder to break apart the components.
And you had mentioned that in California, these solar farms are required to have them recycled?
Yeah, so because California is such a progressive state, they already have regulations in place where solar farms have to recycle them, or at least I'm pretty sure the panels are labeled as universal waste, and so they can't just like dump them. They have to be responsible about disposing of them, and so they have to recycle like the toxic elements at least out of them before they just put them in landfills. And so that makes it better for us working in California because the solar farms and these big companies already have to deal with them responsibly, and we're kind of taking that responsibility away from them in a way, so that only helps them.
So if there are these like laws and regulations like requiring them to recycle the solar panels, then like have you thought about charging them like for that recycling, so like repurposing service instead of like paying them for their waste?
Yeah, we talked about that briefly, how if it ends up being more feasible to just because they could even just donate them to us if it's easier for us to take care of, or they, like you said, we could charge them instead. I think we were operating off of purchasing to begin with, maybe in order just to get ourselves off the ground and running, but definitely further down the line, I think we'd like to consider taking even less of the financial burden off of us by considering that.
So, you had mentioned like for starting out, for right now, like how many people do you think you would need to start this project if you were to start like tomorrow? Based on
Either way, you can start. I mean, if you need help, I can.
I mean, that's not something we have really looked into as of yet. But I think, if you were to think of how much would you really need to operate as a company, I think we would need at least one person who knows how to install solar and get it running on a house. How do we set up the whole system? How do we get it attached to the grid? And then we're going to need at least one person who is able to, make the connections, be like, hey, we're going to collect from this farm, and, this is Habitat for Humanity's building a home in this district, and I'm going to talk to the government about making sure that we're able to connect solar here. And so I think really, end of the day, you might only need like one person to connect, one person for the system, and one person
Maybe
to
someone
do a
to,
lot
like,
of
write grants
logistics.
or like apply for grants.
Yeah.
I can add on real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
So I really talked about like channels and outreach, and in terms of starting out our organization and figuring out how many people we need to, if we were to start tomorrow, obviously we don't have too many channels, so in that way it's a bit of a good thing where the amount of people we need employed is relatively limited. But for the fields that we do need, it's really mostly just finding people who can help us partner with Habitat for Humanity, talked with local districts, and have good connections there as well, so we can really initially start with them. And then also we mentioned having some sort of marketing team, really trying to get our word out there. So some social media presence also requires a lot of people. And then also looking for the installers themselves. It's a bit of a niche job, so finding those people, it'll probably start off being like relatively just a few. But then as we expand, districts have a lot of people in them, and these Habitat for Humanity housing systems have a lot of houses in them too. So whether we want to set up these panels really quickly in a short amount of time is going to require a lot more installers, trained professionals, people who know what they're doing. But if we're willing to take our time setting up these panels in these communities, then having less installers and a little more money to expand our organization is also another possibility. So it doesn't directly answer the question, but it's a decent amount of people for each component of our organization.
For sure. Cool. And I really like the like partnering with Habitat for Humanity, and I don't know if you've like worked with them before, but a lot of times they'll have like a street and they'll build like a couple houses like all together, and a lot of like low income in general is there's often like large districts. So have you thought about like building small community solar versus installing these panels directly on the individual homes?
Like us personally building the housing, or more so just the.
No, like community solar,
I can take
like
this one. Yeah, go for it.
you would have like a small solar farm in like a community.
Yeah, so that'd be a good idea in order to, that'd be another good idea and another avenue that we could look into. But I think it depends on the space that is available in the area that we're building. So, for example, if it's really cramped and it's in a city, it'd make much more sense to just build the solar panels on top of the houses. But if there's a lot more land, then I think that it would make more sense to, you can put the solar into a small solar farm for the community. But it really depends case by case. But I think that putting them on the ground would make it easier for maintenance and repair.
Yeah. I think one thing that's also when you're talking about like do community solar versus on residential was like one thing we talked about was our like in our value and what we can kind of give back to these communities and like these low income families is the ability to get that credit and not having to get the credit and then pay less for their homes. So I think maybe like one thing that's nice about residential is that it's a little easier to balance like, okay, this home, they used up like this much electricity where their panels were able to produce this much, so they were able to generate like 20 credits, and next month they can if they produce less solar and they use a little more energy, they can use it to help cover some of their electricity bill. Whereas with community solar, it could be a little more trickier to figure out like how do we allocate credits if it generates credits. So when we're talking about like helping alleviate bills and living month to month from paycheck to paycheck, I think it can be a little tricky when you're talking community solar because then you're also relying on everyone to kind of be lenient on how much electricity they're using versus how much the farm is generating. Where if like residential, like when it's on each home, like that's more of the family's responsibility to make sure that they're not going crazy with how much electricity they're using. They don't have to worry about their neighbors. So it kind of becomes more of like a tragedy of the common situation.
Yeah, cool. I have one more question, and it is nice soft pitch. What surprised you the most with this project, just when you were going about researching this?
Anyone want to go for it?
I'll go. I was just surprised that with the rise of solar panels and the use of solar panels, that there aren't more companies trying to figure out how to recycle these solar panels because getting the materials and the precious metals with electronics is difficult because they have to mine them out of the earth, and I just thought that it would be kind of a waste to just throw them out and not think about them again. So I was just surprised that there weren't more companies trying to capitalize on that.
I want to add something too. I think for our group, more so rather than the research we were doing, it was really finding ways to make a profit as an organization and to then find a way to expand. Like initially we had some ideas of when a household would go net negative and they essentially save a lot of money from selling their energy back to the grid. We were thinking of taking some of that money that they would sell back to the grid, but that's not really how it works. It's more so, like Noah said, getting a credit system. And so apart from government funding and also working with districts and other organizations and donors, we didn't really know how to get any sort of funding or make any sort of profit. So that's something that definitely took us a minute to solve and find ways to grow.
That's definitely a big part of like why we do these projects, is because like all of you have awesome ideas, but like just thinking about like making it practical very important, to apply to like real world. And we're just really glad, and I think you did a great job. So
Thank you.
yeah, awesome. One more round of applause. Oh, okay. You just want the order. Oh yeah.
He said it's fine to just sit here.
So you all are actually going next. You microgreen?
You should be on record. Yes, I'll be next to you because I get.
No, bro. He said it. Like, how many people? And I was like, oh.
Wait,
Thank you so much for your time. Do you want to?
Squeeze in.
Yeah, they're actually gonna see it.
Oh, I need a pee. I know.
You are no longer in the way, Daniele, but if you lean forward and you are.
Wait, just
let me
keep
just
that.
adjust the camera. So.
Wait, is he in now?
Okay, we're good. Begin.
All right, so the project that we've been working on for the past couple days has been creating a consultant company called Off-Grid Microgreens, which will work alongside AI data centers and utility companies, powered by a microgrid using geothermal energy. We do plan on just using renewable energy in general for this company, but in this project specifically and our case study example, we chose to focus on geothermal energy. So to start off, and hopefully this will just be a reminder for most of you, we wanted to give you a little bit of background on why we chose this topic. So my name is Lily Carrion, and I am a third-year student at the University of Iowa studying environmental science and geography and sustainability.
Hello, my name is Jose. I'm a fourth-year electrical and computer engineering student at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Yeah.
Hi, I'm George. I'm a junior studying computer science and electrical engineering at the University of Missouri.
Hi, I'm Sophie Vandy Clashorst. I'm currently a senior studying electrical engineering at NC State University.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'll be attending Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute this year in the fall. I'm currently undeclared.
Okay, so to give you a brief outline on what we will be discussing throughout our presentation, we'll start with some background over why we chose this topic and the effects that AI data centers are having on our climate currently. Then we'll move into our golden circle, our business model canvas. We'll give a case study example focusing on northern Nevada, and then we'll talk about the feasibility and leave you with some final thoughts. So to start, we wanted to contextualize the significance of data centers in general, and three main factors stood out to me: energy consumption, water usage, and then community and environmental impact. So starting with energy consumption, around 5,426 data centers are implemented since March of 2025. They have been known to use around 17 gigawatts of power, and that's projected to reach 130 by 2030. They take about 12% of the annual electricity demand, with 56% of that coming from fossil fuels. Looking at water usage, it does compete with municipal uses, so things like residents and farmers. Cooling systems are also likely to discharge warm water into nearby rivers and lakes, which does have a negative impact on local biodiversity. And a singular AI company consumes around 20 billion liters of water per year. And then looking at the community and environmental impact, backup generators emit nitrogen oxides, which release a lot of pollutants into the atmosphere. That then creates problems with public health, so things like asthma. There also is a lack of transparency and engagement with the public right now, especially when thinking about that a majority of current data centers are located in vulnerable communities or areas that just face high water stress.
So what we're proposing is creating and developing a microgrid that utilizes geothermal energy production to sustain these AI data centers. To be a little bit more specific, we'll be using co-located microgrids, which essentially means it's separated from the main power grid, but if there's a case that the geothermal power plant produces an excess amount of power, they will send it back to the main power grid to help out the surrounding populace. And I think that'll be really useful just to add that extra public incentive and benefits. How we're going to do this, the first thing we're going to do is find an optimal location for both the power plant, microgrid, and data center. And on top of that, we have to worry about construction and maintenance of the infrastructure while also minimizing any negative impacts that is on the environment or the surrounding populace. To put in perspective how much power these AI data centers actually use, an average Google search uses about 0.003 kilowatts per hour and produces 0.2 grams of carbon. Meanwhile, an average ChatGPT query uses 0.003 kilowatts per hour and produces 68 grams of carbon. So as you can see, these data centers just consume way too much power and put way too much strain on the grid, which is very unsustainable. And I guess we can start with the business model. So the first and most important key resource is money. We can definitely use financing from any public firms like the DOE and EPA, but we can definitely consider private firms like Baseload Power USA and CBO Financial that are known to fund these big geothermal power plant construction projects, and that's definitely an option. As for construction of the data centers, any tech company that uses AI, which is pretty much all of them nowadays, we can use OpenAI, NVIDIA, Google, etc. to help, incentivize and finance these constructions. Material and natural resources are also super important in making this project a reality. So, any minerals, any metals that are needed to construct the actual grid and the data center and the power plant will be useful. But we also have to consider the specific criteria that geothermal power plants need to actually function. So there are a very limited amount of locations that actually can produce geothermal energy, and you need the specific threshold of fluid temperatures for geothermal fluid, which in this case would be 149 Celsius. As mentioned before, we would have to work very closely with any financiers and firms to help make this project a reality. We'll also have to work with any engineering firms too to help actually produce and construct these projects. So any microgrid developers, cloud providers, geothermal power plant construction firms, etc. We'll also have to keep in mind working closely with any local governments or government agencies just to make sure we follow any laws and regulations that come with this project. So in speaking in short-term activities, we'll have to first find an optimal location for the data center and geothermal power plant, actually construction and design of this project, and making sure that it works in the first place. Speaking more in long-term, we'll have to consider any maintenance costs and operations, and we are also considering using any geothermal cooling to mitigate the water usage that comes with cooling these data centers.
Thank you, George. So for our cost structure, we kind of looked into 4 different avenues of what it's going to cost to kind of start this, with the first being construction costs of for the customer being so starting off primarily with the geothermal plant. So depending on the amount of wattage needed for their data center, it costs from $2.5 to $6 million USD per megawatt. And then moving on to the data center cost, it's based on how big it is. So per square foot, it's between $600 and $1,100. And then for the average microgrid construction, it costs between $2 to $5 million per megawatt, which will coincide with the geothermal cost. And then personally, we will be having to kind of spend a lot of money on repairs and maintenance costs, staff salaries, and then all the operational costs we use behind the scenes to find that initial location. So like in our case would be Nevada.
So for our type of intervention, we will be providing a service. As previously mentioned, we will be providing consultation into sources for renewable energy. For channels who will be contacting, we're going to be reaching out to AI divisions on microgrid implementations that use renewable energy. For any surplus revenue that we can make, we'll be putting that into the research and development of renewable energy initiatives, as well as electronic waste recycling. And we'll be reinvesting that into the internal infrastructure, tooling, and engineering resources. And for segments on who will benefit from this will be local communities, as we will be providing sustainable renewable energy, the local power grids, as we will be able to reduce any power strain that they might have, as well as any data center developers, as we can meet any energy requirements that they have.
Cool. So, big question. So, how exactly are we going to make our money? So, the kind of main focus that how we're going to generate revenue is fixed price contracts. So, we have 4 different types of contracts we're basically providing. So, the first is microgrid architecture design, a design blueprint. Second being renewable source integration plans. Third being load balancing and grid resilience strategies. And fourth being grid isolation and power redundancy design. So for these 4 different types of contracts, the revenue stream split is basically 60-40, with both of these about being 30%, and then the other 2 being 40% of our revenue stream.
So for our value propositions, what impact we would be able to make. For environmental impact, we would be able to reduce the CO2 emissions, the consumption of water, as well as the land and water pressure that current data centers that are being built are making. For the societal impacts, as I said before, we can have less grid stress, as well as protect vulnerable communities that currently use non-sustainable forms of energy. And for the economic impact, we will be providing a long-term stability in renewable energy, which will create less reliance on fossil fuels.
Okay, so big ideas, but where do we put it? How do we do it? So we have like a small case study here for Nevada. And so the Great Basin, this whole area, the southwestern United States, has significant electric generation capacity potential through geothermal energy. This is a map from the U.S. Geological Survey from 2025, and they say that there is up to 135 gigawatts of potential power that could come from this area. And there is some geothermal plants already here, but it's not as much that you think it would be given that its potential. And Nevada is a location of interest for data centers already due to its proximity to Silicon Valley, just further over here in the west. And we'd be targeting medium-sized data centers, so they don't have to be the massive hyperscale sites. And it would be site dependent on what is possible at these specific locations.
So based on this specific case study, we would apply 2 of the 4 fixed price contracts. So the first being the microgrid architecture design blueprint, which is we're estimating to be about $350K. And then the next being renewable source integration plans, which is about $200K. At the moment, the average price of electricity is 14 cents per kilowatt hour. Hopefully, we're able to kind of reduce that for the local community as a benefit of like us kind of going in there and maybe helping secure their grid. And then lastly, in total, including those blueprints and plans and stuff, this medium-sized data center is estimated to cost around $80 million. So, yeah.
And this ties into sustainable development goals through, of course, renewable energy. These data centers are primarily powered by fossil fuels, and this would be all the newer sites would be directly powered by renewable energy instead of furthering the economy for the fossil fuels. Second, economic growth, jobs. So these are long-term development projects, so that does bring a lot of skilled labor into these areas, providing some years of employment for them. 9, innovation and infrastructure. So
this is new technology and new infrastructure in these areas, which would support further development of the same stuff in these locations. Sustainable cities and communities, renewable energy, we're, clean, bringing it away from fossil fuels, and then responsible consumption. Since AI is something that is so prevalent and is only becoming more prevalent, by sourcing it in renewable ways, it is becoming more sustainable. Feasibility is a big concern. That's why these projects haven't been done necessarily. So land is a big thing that we have to look into for the site of the geothermal plant and the data center. Federally managed and protected lands are in this area. There are some native reservations as well, and we just have to do early site selection and permitting and trying to look at land that is already disturbed or built on and then converting it. Initial cost of geothermal technology is significant, but doing cost share like the borehole exploration sites, if we find good sites, that does mean that there's potential for many more of these plants that could be used, and then therefore, economy of scale, these costs will go down. Geothermal technology has longer development timelines compared to other sources of energy, and that is kind of what has been some pushback on it. But these data centers are being developed for the next decade or more, so there is time to at least reach some of the need at the end of that. And then increased power draw as data center resources increase. So you'd want to build these new power plants with like modular systems where you can get them on the grid as quickly as you can with room for increased development later on.
Okay, so then once again, just to kind of reiterate everything that we've talked about thus far in our presentation, this is just our business model canvas all laid out. Once again, nothing new here, kind of everything we had already explained. But just to leave you with some final thoughts, AI is here to stay, but its environmental impacts don't have to. Through Iceland, especially, since we've been talking about geothermal energy, we saw how powerful and intuitive these plants were, with many more advancements to come in the future. Sustaining the energy needs of data centers through geothermal energy is imperative to offsetting its massive carbon footprint that it's currently projected to have. And grid isolation can solve the issue of data center strain on the power grid. And I think something that we also just want to mention is that this isn't an end-all be-all solution, but it definitely is a step in the right direction for the future of data centers and AI. Any questions?
From the crowd.
Have you guys thought about which geothermal systems to use? Like what kind of geothermal?
I'd say not specifically, because again, like we don't have like sites picked out because there are a lot of exploration still needs to be done in those regions. We just know there's the capability for it. So, short answer for a long question, but Any other questions?
Well, I've been part of this presentation for very short. We were wondering about like if they had any questions online.
Can we tell?
Dan has questions.
Yeah, Quinn?
Or how do you plan on working with local communities to get these support when projects are coming?
That's a great question, actually. And I think that's really important, especially when, like we mentioned, 2/3 of AI data centers are currently located in high water stress regions. And at the moment, AI is also known as like a black box kind of, because when you type in a Google search, you don't have smoke physically coming out of your computer. And so a lot of people don't know the dangers that it actually has on the environment. And so I think a lot of it just starts with education, because once people are really aware of how much water they're consuming or how much it's affecting their quality of life ultimately, and the atmosphere, and like we talked about, it contributes to air pollution through nitrogen oxides and stuff. I think once they're educated on that, it will be great to get their input so that more data centers aren't located in water stress regions. But kind of to answer your question, like long story short, I think that we could do like community initiatives. I think putting it in the news, just kind of spreading education and awareness will be a great way to start.
Then I can add on to that. And I think a lot of community pushback is something that we've talked to Dan about too, is that it being a microgrid, communities may feel like, oh, so you're creating new power, but it's not going towards us, it's going to the data center. But a lot of times, unfortunately, regardless of like these data centers, of course, they're not gonna be built somewhere where there isn't somewhere to power it, but connecting to the grid with such large loads can have negative impacts just for people there. It decreased grid stability, so you're more likely to have outages at your home, or so having it as a microgrid kind of prevents those issues from affecting the community with it being separate. But then that's why we also wanted to have, if there's it's not going to be like isolated, it will be grid connected. So if there's excess energy, if there is an emergency, then there would be like these agreements where the power from these geothermal plants would also go to the community and not the data center, because people would be the priority, of course. But again, so you start small and then there's a lot of potential. So then hopefully these projects would also increase more geothermal development in the future with the economy of scale. Like doing one's expensive, but the more you do, it would get cheaper for things. Yeah.
So I know for this case study you guys did geothermal, but you talked about how you wanted it to focus like on all renewable energy. Would there be like a second, is like geothermal like kind of your top choice, and if there's like second choice, what would that be?
Yeah, so the issue with that is like it's really insane how much energy these data centers need. You know, I mean, I know your project was on solar, and it would be extremely difficult, at least for this specific case, to implement solar energy because it's just simply not enough to sustain these extreme energy demanding facilities. So there are very few renewable resources that you can actually use, and geothermal. We were talking about hydro too, but hydro and geothermal would be the only feasible resources just because they are one of the few renewables that actually produce enough energy to supplement these data centers. But a big issue with that is because, unfortunately, even though they do produce so much energy, they're not very flexible. I mean, going back to solar, even though solar doesn't produce enough energy, compared to geothermal, they are extremely flexible. I mean, you can really implement solar panels anywhere else. I can't really say the same about geothermal or hydro. So there definitely is a lot more improvement to come with that.
Follow up? Yeah, just follow up real quick. Sorry.
Mhm.
You might not have thought about this, but like this is not like renewable energy technically, but like talking about large amounts of like power coming to the data centers, have you considered or thought about nuclear?
We were talking about nuclear a little bit.
I say, yeah, nuclear is great. It does have so much more like regulation to it federally, and like the timelines are insane. But it does have the capacity, not as flexible necessarily, and there would be a lot more community. Community pushback on that is questionable as well, depending on the area. If people support it, state incentives, and having that as a microgrid is probably a bigger no-no. But
And it's a lot more expensive.
a lot more expensive. Yes, Daniele.
I know you guys talked about building partnerships with companies that already use AI. Have you guys checked if they're really like using any sort of data centers or energy systems that don't rely on fossil fuels? Like if they're already using renewables, or are you guys are first?
I would say, well, from what I know, is a lot of these data centers are just grid connected, so they're just kind of taking whatever the grid is already on. So I think Nevada's was almost like 40% renewables, and then the rest of it is a mix of other fossil fuel sources. So the data centers themselves can't say they're powered by fully renewables, it's just whatever the grid in the area is on.
I can add on to that. So they're trying their best. So like, for example, one of the ways they kind of mitigate this is if they're not trying to use green energy is another big factor that kind of draws energy is trying to cool these systems down. So what some companies are doing, like specifically Microsoft, they'll put their data centers underwater to kind of alleviate that cooling problem, which helps reduce the amount of power that they need to kind of cool these systems down. Follow up, yeah.
I have a pretty good follow-up question.
Yeah.
So does that add to the water issue though?
Yeah,
Like the water-
yeah, exactly.
Wait,
So,
I don't
no,
know.
hold on. So, most of the geothermal potential in the West really comes from the hot water that's super close to the surface. So I'm guessing you guys would probably be using traditional geothermal. If you guys are extracting this water from these hot springs to really, use it as a renewable energy source, this is partly going to contribute to the water problem, as in like, how are you guys going to refill these aquifers or these systems that, depend on water if you guys are trying to mitigate, water consumption to begin with?
And again, like I want to emphasize, location is extremely important in this. Like, for example, Amazon, they have a lot of data centers in the Antarctic, just because they just have so much heat that they produce, and you really want to emphasize, you really want to find locations that have not only geothermal activity but also extremely cold climates that can kind of, they're probably not going to diminish water usage by 100%, but you know, enough to get by. Again, like it's these data centers, they require a lot, so you have to be you need to meet a lot of criteria to actually, you know, get something done about this carbon footprint. Unfortunately, we're doing our best.
Any more? I don't know what the timeline is if the next group needs to go.
I was just gonna say, to go with Jose saying, I was reading an article that in like Europe there was a data center that was underground. They actually used the heat that was being produced to heat the city.
Yes.
They were heating the city.
And there was just like random ideas we were like brainstorming, like throwing out earlier, is like especially in like maybe like here where there's like greenhouses to grow things, like using excess heat from data centers to, you know, do something like that, or using the excess heat. But there is other like geothermal like cooling systems where you have a closed loop system that just eventually gets rid of the heat using the earth as a heat sink, potentially as well. So I'll say last question, and then I guess we'll move on to the next group.
Is it possible or feasible to do like data centers, for example, in Iceland? The geothermal is a lot more widely available. It's like maybe moving to a country where it's easier to do nuclear, or maybe it's easier to do geothermal, is more accessible. Like is that possible?
Yeah, I think our tour guide today was telling us that there was some data centers here, but the reason we targeted the U.S. is because of, I think, almost 70 or 80% of data centers are in the United States and are projected to be there anyways. So, and I think these companies have a lot of money, unfortunately, that they can kind of make whatever work that they want to, for the better or worse. So that's why we were trying to take these solutions to the U.S. Also, I think Iceland probably has, you know, their community might have more pushback against these developments here because of their natural landscapes as well. And it's gonna be here whether we want it to or not. So it's more just trying to convert it to a more positive energy source. But the end. No more questions. Thank you. Thank you.
You guys got no professor questions.
I know. Where's Sam?
We had to avoid everything.
Oh, the most challenging thing.
I don't know how to. You're welcome. I don't know how to full screen it for you. Okay. I shall work on that.
He started like poking holes in yours. Like, we finished. Or like, no, you guys getting through.
I actually, do I like escape first?
But it's a geothermal produces less water.
If I hit escape,
I like when the hot water. It's like a really like significantly less. We should have said that.
I'm sorry. I had to ask.
success.
Yeah. You're saying like they are using the excess heat. That's good. That's really good.
I think you just talk into it. Okay.
Yes, we are ready.
Okay. Sure. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. So. Okay, so. Hello. Okay, so our project is called Funding Florida's Future Preemptive Response for Sea Level Rise. My name is Quinn Callahan, and I use they, or he pronouns. I go to the University of Florida, where I study sustainability in the built environment and urban and regional planning. And a fun fact about me is that I am crosscut saw certified.
My name is Victoria Karp. I go to Virginia Tech, and I am a dual major in ocean engineering and bassoon performance. My fun fact is I play more than 8 instruments. I'm Winter Trumpfeller. I go to San Diego State University. I'm a 4th-year mechanical engineering student, and I can solder microcomponents.
I'm Abby Stouffer. I go to the University of Arkansas. I study political science with a natural resources management minor. And fun fact about me is I've been to 8 countries now. Okay, so for our golden circle, the thing that we are proposing to do is to introduce a sea level rise susceptibility tax on properties in high-risk flood zones, as well as a supplementary tourism tax. And this will be used to fund long-term sea level rise adaptation plans. So there's this concept in sea level rise adaptation planning where you look at all of the potential relevant scenarios in the future, whether that's we're expecting 3 feet of rise, 5 feet of rise, etc. And you develop ideas for at what point you need to invest in what types of adaptation strategies, whether that's seawalls, mangrove restoration,
etc. So we would have at-risk counties develop plans ahead of time according to this model and determine when they need to implement what solutions. And then the innovative part about this is that once the parameters that they establish in their plans are met, they immediately get the funding to implement the solutions. And this would really effectively help equip Florida with resources for preparing for sea level rise and making it a resilient state in the long term.
So these are our 3 sustainable development goals. We have industry, innovation, and infrastructure because the fund is working to improve Florida's infrastructure to deal with sea level risings. Sustainable cities and communities, we're trying to prepare Florida communities once again to deal with sea level rising, and then climate action because sea level rise is a result of climate change.
And so for stakeholders and values, FEMA already does a ton of work in keeping up with flood zones and helping communities recover after disasters. So they would be a really important agency to partner with. Also, we would be working a lot with Florida's state government and local governments, especially community planning departments who would be responsible for a lot of the community engagement because they already know and are in those communities and know how to best engage with the residents on what they need going into the future, and they would also be responsible for drafting the plans. And the main value that we're focusing on is long-term resilience because we want to create a plan that will ensure that Florida is a state that people can continue to live in happily going into the future despite climate impacts. And so as far as how our operations will work, employee salaries would be paid with a very small percentage of the fund, and the fund would mainly go to both paying for the development and the research needed to create the plans in the first place, and to probably have small Zoom workshops that would be educating officials on what they need to do to create the plans, and then literally implementing the adaptation efforts that are outlined in the plans.
Okay, so this is part of how we're planning on funding these plans. So this is a map of, we're gonna go over Sarasota County specifically in Florida. So this is their flood zones. All of the color you see on there are different levels of risk flood zones. So depending on water level rising, they'll get flooded different amounts. So there's certain amounts for each. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, I'll outline some of the numbers that we use to come up with how we're funding this. So we didn't actually use the flood map to determine where the properties were because that took a lot of time, and we did this project in 6 days. So these are all estimates based on other data found online. So the estimated property tax percentage is about 0.79% for coastal regions in Sarasota County, and we're approximating that about 35% of Sarasota County is in a high-risk flood zone. We were able to find the value of homes in Sarasota County, which is about $109 billion, and we'll be using about 35% of that to determine property tax values to do the fund. And we're planning on increasing the property tax to about 0.03%. So the current total revenue at that 0.79% I was talking about is $303 million. And then the new total revenue is going to be about $315 million with that added 0.03%. And so the total amount that's allocated to the fund is about $11 million. And the average per property increase was going to be about $193. Again, all of these numbers can be verified if we had more time. Yes.
So the second part of our funding is the tourism development tax, which does currently exist, and it sits at 6% in Sarasota. So the plan is to slightly increase that, the same amount as our property tax by 0.03%, and then the difference of that 0.03% would go directly to our research fund. So this is, again, still Sarasota. We wanted to keep it the same place. So this is the case study of the profits from the tourism tax. So the second column in the profit was found on the internet, specifically through resources from Sarasota. And then with the 6% tax, I went back and found the total profit that they actually had. And then with the new profit, I found what the total outcome of the tax would be and then the difference. So this one won't amass as much money because it's Sarasota and it's a tourism tax. But over the span of 6 years, including a prediction for 2026, they would have added $1.3 million to this fund. towards benefiting their own town. And then for a better example, since the tourism tax is for the entire state of Florida, we did Orange County, so Orlando. As you can see, the numbers are a lot larger than they were in Sarasota. So it's the exact same process and calculations, but over the span of 6 years, Orange County would give the fund $10.4 million. And then for the overview, just to summarize the financial plan, we're pulling our money from the property tax and then the tourism development tax. Both of them exist already and are already implemented. We're just adding a slight change, with the change going directly to funding to help high-risk zones. For property tax, who's paying it? It's the property owners that fall within the high-risk zones. And then for the tourism tax, it's anyone with short-term rentals or hotels of 6 months or less. And that applies to the whole state of Florida.
Okay, and just for a super brief overview of the types of sea level rise solutions that these plans would be talking about implementing, sea level rise solutions typically fall into one of these three categories, which are protection, accommodation, and retreat. Protection mainly focuses on defending existing infrastructure from any potential inundation. So those are things like hard strategies like seawalls, which just literally keep the water out. There are also mangrove restoration efforts, dune restoration, coastal marsh restoration efforts that can be used to help build up the land and make the land more resilient to erosion and resilient to storm surge, which is also very affected by sea level rise. Also, accommodation strategies seek to alter the built environment to make it more adapted to changing conditions. So rather than preventing any water from coming in, it would be finding ways to make our existing infrastructure coexist with higher water levels. So sometimes that can include putting homes on stilts. It can be like flood-proofing buildings so that either the water isn't able to come into the literal building or it's able to come in without causing damage. And in extreme scenarios, retreat is likely going to be necessary, where we're going to have to move communities, and so having a plan in place ahead of time for how we can responsibly move communities without tons of disruption and injustice is super necessary. And as for measures of success, this would bring a ton of money into the construction industry, which is already huge in Florida, and this would maybe be like a little better than what we're currently doing and would create a lot of jobs, which would be great. It would also lower our costs from natural disasters associated with sea level rise. So this isn't a sea level rise related example, but in Escambia County in 2014, they had a crazy 24-hour flood event. This image, which you can't see the numbers, but it shows that like there's like over 20 inches of rainfall in the red areas here in 24 hours, which is crazy. Horrible flooding. And they weren't prepared for this at all. There's probably no way to have infrastructure that's fully prepared for this, but it led to stuff like this, like over entire county. So they've had to do some really extensive projects to prepare for any potential future events like this. But if they had had the funding ahead of time to predict that something like this could have happened and to get ahead of it and already have that infrastructure in place, they probably wouldn't be dealing with a situation like this where they're having to both fund updated infrastructure and deal with like disasters to that scale.
Okay, and then some of the things that makes our plan feasible or not, the residents may become resistant to these taxes. And so part of this is that the people living here, they may not believe until they like see the issue, and they might have grown up with their own like political or social beliefs that just would make them very resistant, and they might protest these new taxes. And then there would also be potential political opposition, so both from the people living there and then from the government, like the actual state of Florida as well, because they may not agree with what these taxes are going for. And they could also have a negative impact on tourism. So if there's a higher tax on people coming to tour Florida, like maybe people here who come like every year or every other year or so, then they're less inclined to come there, and Florida's economy really strives off of tourism, so their economy could take a big toll if there's all these new taxes implied. And then it's also adapting to the effects of climate change and not really solving it, so some people might be less inclined to support these new, like this new program and these new taxes.
if they don't really see the benefit from it, if it's not directly solving the issue. And then there's also insurance companies. This would be more of a pro, like more to make the plan more feasible, but they can stay in Florida if the risk of homes is like being destroyed by the sea level goes down. And then last, we have the potential property value decreases due to the sea level rise, and the higher, so part of this is the higher insurance prices also decreases the home values as well. And then this is just our business model, like the whole canvas, so where we go over everything that we already talked about basically. And then in conclusion, there are alterations. So we're going to make alterations to the tourism tax and the SLRS tax, which will be utilized to fund the creation and the implementation of long-term sea level rise adaptation plans and through this organized program. And so the feasibility really just depends on one of the biggest factors is the political instability right now. They don't know if they can get like the support, both politically and then like funds as well. They don't know like the funds where they might be coming from. They're not always super secure, and this mostly includes like the property values of the coastal homes, like the homes living on the coast, they would go down. And then thank you for coming. Any questions?
So I have a bit of a two-part question. The first is, does the Florida government already really provide some of the tax money towards, mitigating the effects of sea level rise and also protecting the city? And if so, what is that really going towards? Like, what physical ways do they actually try to protect the city?
So Florida is a weird state because I talked to some people who worked in emergency management as it relates to floods for one of my classes this past semester, and they're not allowed to talk about climate change, really, which is insane because, like, it's Florida. So it's a very weird issue. There's like some acknowledgement of sea level rise, and there are some like plans, but there isn't anything that, as a lifelong resident of Florida, I would say is like effective or honestly really meaningful. There's definitely programs that are trying to like prepare places that have been hit by hurricanes, but then obviously like the federal government is screwing with a lot of that now. And it's like.
So there is currently a tax in place that I believe it is pulling from the tourism tax. Most of it is split into like 20 categories though from that 6%. A very small portion of it goes to flooding. So this is more because of how small that percentage is, we want to make it more. But through a specific program, so they can't be like, yeah, more money, let's send it elsewhere, and disregard that our houses are gonna be like sucked out to sea.
I can also add one thing. Also, a lot, like generally within disaster and like hazard planning, the big problem with it is that it is very reactive. So you get like a crazy hurricane that like kills 200 people or something, and then you do the infrastructure. You don't say, hey, we could get a hurricane that could kill 200 people based on the existing data we have about our community. Let's maybe make sure that that doesn't happen. So this is kind of trying to get ahead of that disaster management cycle. But yeah.
And just like as a bit of a follow-up, I know you guys just mentioned that some of the tax money very little of it already goes towards this sort of stuff. What is the public perception of that? Like, are they happy with that, with their money going towards that? And if yes or if no, how would your implementation really affect public opinion?
So Florida is generally a conservative state. So when you talk about like climate change or you sound to like whatever with people will get turned away from that. However, I have grandparents who live in a really obnoxious beach house that they are currently selling because the insurance is like leaving, because you can't you can't insure a house that every year is going to get totally wrecked by a hurricane. And so public perception is definitely a big issue, but
when someone is seeing something that is happening directly in front of their face, like we're getting to the point where people are going to have to acknowledge something. Yeah, it just difficult.
One thing we also discussed was something that was noticed in other places is once the insurance companies start to believe it, or like the big companies that people believe in start to believe it, the smaller people start to believe it, I guess. That's one thing why we wanted to go to like insurance companies, because this protects their assets too, because those houses that are being destroyed by sea level rising are their assets, and it's like they can't keep doing business in a place where their assets are going to keep being destroyed. Like, it's not worth it. So if you get the insurance companies to side with you, that also gets other people who wouldn't necessarily believe in climate change like that to also agree with it and potentially, yeah.
Basically, lots of money in politics, and we can use Citizens United to our advantage if we can get insurance companies to.
Go ahead.
So I know you were saying how like this is kind of an attempt to basically like change the whole like reaction to disasters instead of like being proactive. Like you're trying to make people be proactive more so. And so like I guess in that sense, like I don't know if you've looked into this or not, but like if you have, are there any like other states that also have like a tax that are like being more proactive about it than just reactive?
Not that I've really seen.
Yeah, we haven't really seen any that.
There is a lot of flooding tax
Like,
across the country.
they're different.
It's like absurdly high in the state of New Jersey, but not per se seafloor rising specific taxes.
Yeah, I like most of what I've like covered in like my education like on these topics is focused on Florida, and all of it that isn't on Florida, like generally everywhere, just sort of like we're not doing a great job on this.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
I have two questions coming from Jake directly. So I'm just going to pass those. How would this fund work alongside existing flood insurance, replace or undermine it?
So existing flood insurance is meant, from my understanding, is meant to be reactive. So it's like a flood comes in and it messes up your house, so you put in a claim, and then that helps you like after an issue. Instead, this is meant to be proactive. So instead, on a larger like county scale, the county planning board creates a plan with the funding saying that we are expecting there are like three different sea level rise scenarios for like the next 50 years. And these are like 3 different scenarios we could potentially expect. And here are 3 different pathways we could go down in preparing for the future based on these scenarios. And then say, okay, maybe, and then they would have to determine parameters. So if this thing happens, if we see flooding to this level that we've never seen before, we need to implement this strategy. So they see funding to that level, therefore it's triggered from the state government that they are given the funds to implement like a seawall or to have like massive scale like mangrove restoration or something like that. So it's a separate thing, and hopefully it would also reduce costs that would have to go to flood insurance because it would be being addressed on a larger community scale rather than just individual homes.
Very good explanation. I have a second question. Do you think this would encourage people to reduce the risk, or could it reward people staying in high-risk areas?
I think it would actually help people understand their risks a lot better personally, because if you're showing people a map, or like if you're a Floridian and you've had like a hurricane coming at you, you have looked at a flood map because you're just like, oh crap, like do I have to evacuate? But this would make it show up where it's like, okay, I'm in an area that is dangerous to live in, so the government is going to charge me more to live in this area because it costs more to protect people who live in areas that are at higher risk. So it's forcing people to like factor in, okay, it's a nice desirable area and I can walk to the beach, but like it's like the beach is going to be even closer soon. So yeah.
I don't know too well like the really geographical layout of Florida, or more so which areas are directly affected by flooding and sea level rise. But would your tax be more so statewide or really based on districts that are affected by it? Because you know, if there's districts that aren't affected by it, why would they be paying the tax that they don't really get?
Yeah. Yeah. Or
So the idea specifically with the property tax is that it's statewide, but it's only for people in high-risk flood areas. So it applies to every single county, but it's only if you're in one of those flood areas that's like dangerous. And it's reevaluated every 5 years to see if like you're still in that high-risk flood area or not.
So like if you're in the middle with no touch of water, you're
You're
not
not gonna
actually
see the-
paying it.
Yeah, so
Which is why we had the slight tourism tax. And the tourism tax is the whole state, in part because eventually the sea level will keep rising. So who ends up being the flood zone will eventually get closer and closer into the middle. So that is a part of the long-term like fund, with also the mindset of, hey, you might eventually be these people. You might appreciate this funding. But the tourism tax is the whole state, and the property tax is just the county's residents / properties within the flood zones.
like technically it would be applied to the whole state, but only specific people within the state, like properties.
Also, with the tourism tax, because a lot of people go to Florida, like our natural environment is a huge part of that appeal. And so if you want to come here and enjoy that, the logic is that you should be paying to protect that. Yeah, and that's part of it. Cool.
Yay, we're done.
Does this go to you?
Now we
I
just
don't
have a
know.
journal.
Thank you.
What? Oh, sorry.
Why does it only open at 6? We should rebel.
Oh wait, do you guys want a group photo with your front sign?
Oh, I actually do. Like, that is. Oh my.
Good idea.
Holy cow.
Oh yeah, we're doing